tell you, he's much friendlier than his picture. And if you want to start a conversation with strangers everywhere you go, take his book, God Is Not Great With You, to airports. I've had a lot of fun with that in the last couple of weeks. I asked each of them how they wanted me to address them. And Christopher asked for St. Christopher. I nixed that. So, Mr. Christopher Hitchens, Rabbi Kushner. I could go on, but you know what I find? All I have to say is, you know, the man who wrote When Bad Things Happen to Good People, and they all go, oh, yes, the rabbi. Rabbi Harold Kushner. I found this little tidbit about Professor Peter Gomes. Did you know, I mean, he's given prayers at two presidential inaugurations, but he also was in the inaugural issue of Talk magazine in 1999. Here was the title of the article: The Best Talkers in America, 50 Big Mouths We Hope Will Never Shut Up. Reverend Peter Gomes, Professor Peter Gomes. Let's get started. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to give a little of your personal narrative, but let's start with an essential question I mentioned is on a lot of people's minds. What difference does it make whether there's a God? And I really encourage you to talk to one another as you answer the question. What difference does it make whether or not there's a God? Who would like to start?
All right, Connie, let me try that first.
Okay.
Maybe half the time it doesn't make a whole lot of difference because whatever you're doing isn't affected by that. But there will be times where you need strength and you're not sure where to get that strength from. There will be times when life will impose things on you that require resilience, and you're not sure you have enough resilience to meet the challenge. There will be times where you find yourself in a dilemma. You don't know which road to choose. Your whole future depends on it. Where do you go for a sense of direction? I like to believe, following a passage of the Jewish Midrash, that God is like a mirror. And sometimes you have to look into God's mirror and you understand who you really are for the first time. That's where the presence of God makes a difference.
I invite the audience to join the thought experiment, but I shall, of course, lead you in the prayers. Picture, if you will, the following, that it is conclusively demonstrated that the figures of Abraham, Moses, Jesus, Muhammad, Joseph Smith, all the other imposters are nothing more than that. Legendary or mythical or fraudulent figures. Are you going to start screwing in the streets? Are you going to start stealing each other's property? Are you going to start not caring about one another or your children? Are you going to have no source for your ethics and your morals? I submit that this is not so, and that those who said to you that the source of morals and ethics must be in some sense godly or supernatural have been fooling themselves and trying to fool you. If there was no God and if there were no prophets and no revelation, our moral dilemmas would be exactly as they are now. Who doubts it? That's my answer.
Professor?
Well, I'm neither brave enough nor smart enough to function in a universe without the God construct. I don't want to think that I'm here all on my own, and I don't want to have to think that I have to make it up all on my own. I rather like the company of believers. And there's been a lot of bad stuff done, but there's been a lot of good stuff done. And if I have to gamble, I'd rather gamble on both inhibition and blessing than gamble on sheer rational self-interest. So I can't conceive of a world without God, and I would like to think that God couldn't conceive of a world without me.
Each of you is here tonight because of what you believe. That's why you were invited to the forum to address the audience. And I'm wondering, what is at stake for you personally in your beliefs?
Even faced with the near sublime geniality of comrades Kushner and Gomes, I'd have to say, at the risk of seeming too solemn and maybe too severe, that for me it's become, especially over the last 20 years or so, since First, the fatwa against Salman Rushdie that extended violent Islamic religious theocratic terrorism right into the heart of our own culture, but then the subsequent events that no one has any difficulty picturing, that for me it's become a survival question. I think the parties of God really sincerely intend the destruction of everything I know of and care about that's worth defending. And I, in turn, sincerely wish, hope to defeat them. And I make no sectarian exemption for this. The messianic Jewish settlers on the West Bank who think that by stealing other people's property they can bring on the Messiah are my foe. So are the people in the Muslim Brotherhood, sometimes disguised as Hamas, who claim in that name to be their enemy. So is the appalling idea, very now imminent, that our worst nightmare is about to occur, that an apocalyptic regime, an apocalyptic theocracy, in this case in Persia, will acquire apocalyptic weaponry, something we've all been dreading for a long time. It's about to be upon us. And of course the attempt to stultify American children and American culture by teaching pseudoscience and nonsense in the schools as we try and celebrate the anniversaries of Darwin and Lincoln. All of this to me is the same fight. And I've decided to devote my life to making sure that reason and secularism and their cognates, democracy and civilization, are not destroyed in this way, that the victory goes instead to our side. Voila.
You know, Connie, I would hope that one of the, unspoken ground rules for this evening's discussion was that we don't compare the worst of one side with the best of another. Let's take religion and skepticism at their best, or let's take religion and skepticism at their worst, but not compare the sins of religion with the virtues of secularism or the other way around. What's at stake? What's at stake for me? Bedrock, I guess, is the issue of whether my life has any transcendent meaning. Does it make a difference at some significant level whether I lie or tell the truth? Does it make a difference whether I'm faithful to my marriage vows or I stray from my marriage vows? Does it make a difference if I conduct myself honestly or if I try and cheat? Now, I will be the first to admit that there are people who pass themselves off as religious, and they commit adultery, and they cheat their neighbors, and they conduct elaborate Ponzi schemes, and they are an embarrassment to anyone who affirms religion. But you don't judge any idea or any system by its worst exemplars. You judge it by what is the capacity to do for people who want it at their best.
I am a confessed Christian, and that means that for me it is impossible to be religious in general. One is always religious in particular. Now, I'm a Christian because that's the world into which I was born. But I'm also a Christian because I have been intrigued by what I call the experiment of the gospel. That is to say, no one's ever really tried it. And it would be interesting to see what would life be like if people really did try it. So my whole commitment as a Christian has been to try to translate the great and high theory of our faith into practical living experience. I can't remember who it was, somebody out there will doubtless tell me, who said, religion is not an experiment that has been tried and found wanting. It's an experience that has been wanted and never really tried. And my job is to try it, and to try to persuade other people to try it, to be mindful of our weaknesses and our excesses, which we confess every Sunday, and also to be mindful of the much higher vision without which I wouldn't dare contemplate this world. So my stake is high, but it's also very particular. If it were not, I'd find another way to make a living, of which there are many, and many far easier than this one.
Mr. Hitchens, I suspect you have a response.
I'm sorry, I'll just have to say that I think anyone who applauded either of the foregoing remarks is incredibly easily pleased as well as incredibly easily amused. Is it not the case that we are not here tonight to discuss how good a humanist can you be? How does Judaism or Christianity help you to be a good husband or father or citizen? The claims of religion are not that. The question is this, and I certainly don't claim to be a better citizen, husband, father, or even debater than anyone else on the basis of my beliefs. But isn't it the case that religion says that that's where morals come from in the first place? My challenge is the following. Not just, can you name me, ladies and gentlemen, brothers, sisters, comrades and friends, I've done this in front of many audiences now, there's a prize for the person who can do it. Name me an ethical statement or an ethical or moral action made by a believer that couldn't be made or performed by a non-believer. You have time to think about it. Email it to me if you like. You have all the time in the world. No one's been able to do it yet. There is a prize, and I'll tell you later, what, perhaps, if you're good, what it'll be. But no one's put their hands up, have they? They never do.
May I try one question?
You may, by all means, Rabbi, but there's a corollary question before I stop. Name me a wicked action performed or recommended, or an evil thing said by a believer that is said because of their belief only, that a secularist would not be able to do. And everyone has immediately thought of something. Every one of you knows. The genital mutilation community, entirely theocratic. The suicide murder community, almost entirely theocratic. The shall we terrify children by telling them about hell as a consequence of masturbation community is entirely theocratic. Actually the child abuse community in general, more or less, it slightly irritates me to have to appear with spokesmen for great religions who always act as if they've got absolutely nothing to apologize for, when the reverse is the case.
Rabbi?
Well, for one thing, I think religion, any sensible religion, has a lot to apologize for and acknowledges it. And let's not pretend they don't. To judge religion in the year 2009 on the basis of what was said 3,000 years ago is a little bit like condemning today's medicine because of the terrible things that doctors did to patients in the Middle Ages.
Is it?
You want something which you can get from religion you can't get elsewhere? What about the sense of a person troubled by the fact that he keeps doing things he doesn't want to do and needs to feel cleansed and needs to feel that there is a possibility of his changing himself, which is why the 12-step programs are so remarkably effective, because they say, you keep doing it yourself, you're not going to climb out of it, you've got to turn to that higher power. I don't see anybody doing that without some sort of what I would call a spiritual religious source.
I've spent a great deal of time in the religious tradition out of which I come, confessing my sins. Some might think that's a morbid preoccupation. It is not. One of those sins is the sins of arrogance, thinking that we know everything. Another is the sin of ignorance, not knowing that we don't know anything. Which is why at the center of most responsible liturgies is a confession which acknowledges that religion is a human construct, not a divine construct. And as human beings, flawed as we are, we're going to construct religions which will aspire to great things, but which will, in some level, be incapable of those great things because it depends on us. Fallible, frail, difficult human beings. I need the sense of something that transcends my little world and my little religious construction and my little conviction that will press me onward, that will press me upward, that will give me something worth aiming at. And I think, at the very best, religion is an aspiration, not an achievement. And that's why I do what I do. I aspire.
I couldn't, if the Reverend Professor, well, the Professor Reverend will say again what he just said. that a religion is not God-made but man-made, then I'm done.
Good.
Well then, let's go drink.
Man made God in his own image. That's why there are so many gods. That's why the gods often say such stupid and wicked things. That's why they fight with each other. Religion is what you would expect if it was created by primates who are half a chromosome away from a chimpanzee, which we now know it to be. So, voila, I rest my case.
Professor Gomes, is he obviously toying with your premise? I mean, how would you respond to what he just said?
I'd say we've enjoyed your company this evening. I hope we meet again.
Okay.
No, it seems to
I did ask for that. I must. Hello, I must be going.
It does seem to be, from my lifelong study of religion, that if this is in fact dropped down from heaven in some deus ex machina, or that God is the dictator, the author of everything that's in the Bible, he needs a good editor. This isn't the way it is. These are human aspirations, an attempt for human beings to acquire something grander and more noble than we ourselves are. The hint of God, it seems to me, is not so much God winking at us from on high. It's our trying to catch a glimpse of what, for lack of a better word, we will call the divine. And it is that aspiration to which I commit my life, and those who have a better vision of it than I do, saints and seers and holy people, I honor. But I want us always, especially religious people, to remember that what we are doing on this side of full and perfect knowledge is always going to be imperfect and incomplete. And religious people, I should know, I live with them. Religious people are among the most imperfect and incomplete people that I know.
Rabbi?
Excuse me.
Sure.
Peter, I wonder if there's a middle ground here where we could say that religion originates with God, and when human beings try to write it down and institutionalize it, it always falls short of the perfection of the original revelation. That the Israelites came to Sinai and met God and tried to write down what that encounter meant to them. And inevitably, I think we've all experienced, if you have this wonderful thing happen to you, you try to tell a friend about it, you will never capture the wonderfulness of it in your words. That's what happened at Sinai. They tried to write it down in what became the Bible, and it is an imperfect, flawed, incomplete record of what I think was a transcendent experience.
Now, Bertrand Russell was asked once, well, what if you die, check out, and you're confronted with your maker or St. Peter or whoever it is, and you have to give an account of your unbelief. And he said, in that event, I should say, "Oh Lord, you did not give us enough evidence." Now, I feel I've spent a lot of my life trying to improve on that, but I'm not going to do that now. I want to say, with the Reverend Professor Gomes, what I feel is he isn't giving me enough to disagree with or disagree about. I mean, of course, by all means, I think one of the great cultural projects that we all must involve ourselves in and agree to undertake now is, given that most of us at least half suspect that the heavens are empty, what are we to do in the absence of the supernatural about, or even the spiritual, but say with the numinous, or if you want, the spiritual, the feeling that there's more to life than just the banal, the feeling that is given to us by love, or by music, or by architecture. To be an atheist is not to say that these things are nothing, or count for nothing. Say, how shall we handle the numinous in the event that there isn't a supernatural? I would give it as an example. I wrote a short book about the Parthenon, still one of the great buildings of civilization, and still with the great power to stir. I don't believe in the cult of Pallas Athena. I don't. I don't believe in Athenian imperialism. I don't believe in the Panathenaic procession. I don't believe in the Eleusinian mysteries. But I couldn't be without that building. I couldn't. If it was destroyed, it would be worse for me than the destruction of, say, Chartres or the Great Mosque at Damascus.
Why?
It just would. There's something about the symmetry of Hellenistic architecture and what went with it that means an enormous amount to me, and that I couldn't quantify, and I don't feel I have to. Those who are here would either know what I meant or wouldn't. And it's just as when Francis Collins, who's become a friend of mine, I hope I'm not banging on too much about this, but I think we've come to a certain point. He's a believing Christian. He also ran the Human Genome Project. He says that he was hiking one day in the uplands of, I think, Washington State, and he came across a frozen waterfall that had frozen in 3 streams, like a trinity. And he said at that moment, he fell to his knees and accepted Jesus Christ as his personal savior. Now, I don't respond to nature like that. And my hikes are much less demanding, I freely admit. And also, what if there'd been 4 streams or only 2, and there wasn't a trinity? All this is at hazard to me. And I'm with William James. The varieties of religious experience, they're subjective, they're real to the people they happen to. But you can't tell me because you've seen the Virgin Mary appear to you that I must accept the doctrine of the virgin birth. And what we are not talking about here, because we're also liberal and grown up and tolerant and broad-minded, is what the real problem is, which is that there are all around the world and in our own society people who believe that their own membership of a party of God gives them the right to tell me what to do. And I mustn't be the only person on this stage tonight who emphasizes that fact.
Professor Gomes, I wonder what you make of when Mr. Hitchens started a little bit ago. He basically was saying that perhaps you've been too polite, and that in making your argument, you've given him not enough to disagree with yet. How would you respond to that? Because I suspect you have a little more.
I wasn't aware that it was my job to feed red meat to Mr. Hitchens.
He won't rise.
He had to get it on his own.
He won't rise.
But I'm going to take the opportunity that you have given me, not to answer your question, but to say something else.
All right.
I was at Harvard just at the point where the great theologian Paul Tillich died. He was in Chicago. And there was this wonderful account that somehow a telegram was dispatched to Karl Barth in Basel that the great theologian Tillich had died. And apparently Barth's reply was, now he knows. Now, there's a great deal that I do not know about the substance of my faith. I don't know, I find it impossible to explain the Trinity, and I find it very difficult to believe the explanations that have been offered, but it's part of the furnishings of the household in which I have chosen to live. And I am curious, eager, even anxious to find out. So I don't want to reject it because somehow it doesn't square with my little...
Don't be in a hurry to emulate Professor Tillich.
Oh, I'm not.
Promise.
Except that now
Promise
he
you
knows.
won't do that.
Except that now he knows. I can't reject what I can't square with my little brain. I belong to a community of people who, in many ways, having less opportunity than I, or who might, in some cases, even know less than I, have nevertheless committed themselves to a great ideal and should feel wicked when they live less than that ideal. I aspire to that, which is why, I could leave the Christian church. I could say phooey on it. A lot of silly people, a lot of silly beliefs, a lot of bad behavior, but I'm not going because I haven't found anything better to embrace my soul, my imagination, or my mind. So there I am.
Let's step back a bit. Let's get away from the titles, the positions we hold. Something that all three of you have in common with one another and with everyone in this room is your own personal narrative, how you got to where you are in terms of your perspective on God and religion. And Rabbi, I'd like to start with you if I could. If you all could do it fairly briefly, give a little bit of a story about your lives and how you got here. I think that would really help people to understand how you ended up where you are.
I grew up in a conventional middle-class Jewish household, taking religious involvement moderately seriously, more as a matter of community than as a matter of theology. And I still think religion is more about community than about theology. It's about who you belong to more than it's about what you believe. But I went to rabbinical school because I wanted to serve the Jewish people. Was given a conventional notion of how God works and what the world looks like. And that served me pretty well until the day the doctor told us that our 3-year-old son had a rare and incurable disease, which would leave him in physical and psychological pain every day in his life and cause his death in his early teens. And at that point, I had this shattering experience that everything I had grown up believing was not true. I didn't know what to do. I went through a very difficult couple of months. I didn't want to be angry at God. I didn't want to live the rest of my life without God. But I didn't know if I could continue as a rabbi celebrating every Sabbath another family's child growing up and knowing that my son never would. The breakthrough came to me reading the book of Job and reading an essay that Archibald MacLeish wrote about his play J.B., the modern dress version of Job, in which he suggested essentially that God is not all-powerful and God is looking for our forgiveness for the unfairness of the world. And to me, that was an absolute revelation. Everything changed at that moment. I don't totally agree with what MacLeish was saying, but the idea that God is not in control of everything, that if I must choose between an all-powerful God who is not kind and fair, or else an awesomely powerful God who is kind and fair but not totally in control, I would rather worship God for his kindness than worship him for his power. Where did we ever get the idea that power is the most admirable attribute we can assign to God? And everything else that I've come to believe flowed out of that transformative experience.
Mr. Hitchens, I think some in the audience would be surprised to learn, because they haven't read your book, how deeply involved you've been in studying religion and your own experience with religion. Could you talk about that, please?
Yes, by all means, if I'm allowed to say again that I find I'm pushing at another open door. Now we have a rabbi who doesn't believe that God is all-powerful or omniscient or omnipresent. I mean, what next? I don't know. These are concessions. It normally takes me hours to wring from people. I can't get these guys into the ring. For me, it's a very simple.
If you'd like me to make life easier for you by staking out a ridiculous position.
I should probably tell that England was my country of birth, and in England, I don't know quite how to explain this. This really is like trying to explain the Trinity, but when Queen Elizabeth dies, her bat-eared, chinless son will at that moment become the head of the state, the head of the armed forces, and the head of the Church of England. And that's what you get for founding a dynasty on the family values of Henry VIII. One of the consequences of this is that the Protestant religion is compulsorily inculcated in English schools. You have to be taught it, and it has to be taught as if it was true. And so I'm quite familiar with the King James Bible.
Could you tell the story about the teacher when you were quite young?
Mrs. Watts, thank you, yes. The King James Bible, I'll just simply say, is the only book ever written by a committee that has any beauty to it. I think it's because the conclave of bishops who wrote it for the king was writing at just the point where Shakespeare was beginning to publish his plays, and the English language and vocabulary were multiplying and enriching themselves. It is a remarkable thing. The Church of England should now have dumped it in favor of some rubbishy Good News Bible. It's like the king who threw away a pearl richer than all his tribe. But that's how I was brought up, and I wouldn't be without the beauty of the liturgy of that and the Cranmer prayer book either. It'll be with me till my last hour. However, there came a moment when Mrs. Watts, my nature and scripture teacher, she doubled in these two roles, which she would take us on walks to point out the beauties of birds, trees, flowers, and all this, and then she'd do the search of the scriptures machine. She said to us one day, over-ambitiously, as I now think, "Well, children, notice how lovely the woods and the trees are today, and see how they're so beautifully done in shades of green. And green," she said, "is the color most restful to our eyes. And isn't it nice of God to have designed it that way, that he's put the vegetation to be adapted, to make it nicest for our eyes? After it could have been orange or purple or something that would be very clashing." And I thought, I was 10, I thought, this is bullshit. I didn't know anything about chlorophyll or photosynthesis or adaptation by natural selection or evolution by didn't know any of that at all. Neither did she. Neither at that point did anyone know much about DNA or these things. I just knew somehow, no. My beautiful blue eyes, the source of my sexual charisma, have adapted to the vegetation, not the other way around. I knew that. I knew it as if I'd been taught it.
At 10, you knew.
I knew it as if I'd been taught it. So the idea that one has a duty to God, or that now the Rabbi says God has maybe a duty to us, who owes whom the explanation, has always been to me very strictly a non-question. And its subject, theology, a non-subject. And I'm sorry that that's as far as I've been able to go.
Professor Gomes?
Well, one should not build a career on the inadequacy of one's instruction. And I do think that's... we have all had bad religious instruction. I had a Sunday school teacher who patted me on my head, and she said, we were reading about George Washington Carver, and she said, "Doesn't it please you, dear boy, to know that one of your people invented the peanut?" Now, I knew what she was trying to do. I knew what she was trying to say, but she was totally incompetent. And I'm happy to say that I have sat at the feet of wiser and better informed people over the years, and I'd like to think that the complexities of the queen of the sciences, theology, for better or worse, have become a little more available to me. But one of the problems with the theology has been theologians tend to speak only to each other. And the vast majority of the praying, thinking, working people know next to nothing about theology. I suspect this is a profoundly average audience here tonight of profoundly theologically ignorant people.
Ooh,
who know next to nothing about it.
I hope you remember I said I heard you were really smart.
I've met many cleverer people than Mrs. Watts since then. But I've never met anyone who's come up with a better argument than she has done. You either believe that God has a plan and you're part of it, or you don't. And her naive and simple way of putting it was as good as as well put, I mean to say, as I've heard it since. All else is commentary.
Well, in that respect, you're fortunate. You have something to remember. I would say that indeed, for most of us in the Christian tradition, we flatter ourselves that God does indeed have a plan. We may not quite yet know what it is. Revelation is the unfolding of this design and this plan in which we hope to have a part, or hope to play a part in some sense. And it would be nice to think that God knew what God was doing. It would be very nice to know that this is not all random chance and chaos. But I would say that one of the great religious problems is not that people are too religious and know too much about religion, but they don't know enough about it, and certainly don't know the ways of thinking that this rather complex human science has developed. Part of my job as a preacher and a teacher is to try to make some of that clear. Now, indeed, there's a lot of medieval nonsense, and there's a lot of contemporary nonsense. And it's our job to try to sort that out as best we can until somebody smarter than we comes along and says, ha, 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 this is the way, not that way. And that keeps going until we see fully, we see wholly. That's another reason I believe in God. I look forward to the day when it will all be clear. Somebody will have the answer. I can't wait.
Rabbi, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, it seems to me that we're falling into the almost unavoidable trap of speaking about God as if God were a person. Is he or is he not a bearded old man who lives in the sky? To talk about what God knows, to talk about aspects of God. I go with the Jewish philosopher Maimonides, who says anytime you talk about God using human language, you're being metaphorical, you're being poetic. Something being pleasing in the sight of God doesn't imply that God really has eyes, that God really has hands. It's poetry. I'm struck by the fact that in the Hebrew Bible, the name of God is a verb and not a noun, as if to imply that theology is about what God does, not what God is. To talk about what God is or is not is presumptuous. To talk about what God does is a reflection of human experience.
Are we not, though, are we not risking the elision of a very simple distinction, which is between deism and theism? I mean, someone who says they believe in God may be a deist, who says that, well, it looks as if there could be a prime mover or some kind of designer. At least the coherence and rhythm of things can seem to call for this. And before Einstein and before Darwin, that was the default position of most intelligent people, as late as Thomas Jefferson. And why not? It makes a kind of sense. But to be a deist is one thing altogether. To be a theist, all your work, in other words, to be a religious person, all your work is still ahead of you once you've established there's a God. You've still got to prove this God cares about you, knows about you, is interested in who you sleep with and how, what you might eat and on what day, what side in a war he will take, whether he has a favorite tribe or a favorite species or a favorite cause. That's what it is to be religious. Now, I'm not going to let you off the hook about this. Belief in God is quite different from being religious.
Oh, but
and so, if I was to ask you, do you think that God has a special covenant with the Jewish people or not? You're not going to pretend I'm inventing some dumb question.
No, what I would say is, yes, if you acknowledge that that statement is poetry and not descriptive.
I think it's awful prose, myself.
To say God cares, to say God knows, to say God takes sides.
God makes a special covenant with the Jewish people, or he does not. Which?
Pardon me?
God makes a special covenant with one people, the Jewish people, or does not. What's poetic about this question? I don't know where you come out on it.
I'll tell you where I come out. That God's relationship to the Jewish people is not a theological statement, it's a historical fact. Unless you can tell me that somebody else, unless you can...
You have sources of information denied to everyone else here.
Try this one. Were the Psalms written by the Jewish people or by some other tribe? Were the prophets representative of come out of the Jewish people or someone else? Did the biblical tradition come out of the Jewish tradition? That's what I mean, that God has a special relationship with the Jewish people. He can have a special relationship with other people as well. But again, it is so tempting and it is so misleading to talk about God as if he were the president of the world who has certain policies and certain limitations and certain attributes.
I agree, it's absurd. I just don't think it's misleading if you are religious to say that such a person exists, has plans, gives orders, expects commandments to be followed. Or if you don't, you don't, and I'm welcome to the fold and so on. I mean, could I just ask, do you, sir, Professor, Reverend, do you think that God gave his only son for the redemption of the world?
I do.
Very good.
And I believe that we, who are Christians, believe that because we have no other way to explain our relationship to God, our relationship to one another, or our relationship to this person called Jesus Christ. There's no other way that makes sense. And religion, for most of us, is trying to make sense of that which is beyond sense. Not nonsense, but beyond sense.
Whereas Maimonides says that the claim of Jesus to be the Messiah is a deceitful and blasphemous lie, and fully justifies the sages ordering his crucifixion. I mean, just saying, I'm just trying to reduce the level of ecumenical piety in the room. These are major questions on which people have laid and lost their lives, and we, I think, should talk about them as if they are as serious and as divisive and elemental as they are, not as if it was competing versions of some kind of goodwill.
Professor Gomes?
I'm among the first who will acknowledge the divisive quality of religion, because we all slice reality quite differently from wherever our point of view is or whatever our interest is. And our traditions are at war with one another because of our desires to pay and play special claims in the world. That is not to diminish any of those traditions. It's to acknowledge that human beings, overwhelmed by conviction, are likely to do very nasty things to other people because they have, in most cases, forgotten the first principles of whatever religious tradition it is to which they are adhering.
Forgotten the first principles. I have to take you up on that, I'm sorry. His Holiness the Pope has this week rehabilitated into his church 4 formerly excommunicated bishops. I'm sure most people here know what I'm talking about, of a formerly heretical schismatic sect, one of whom denies that there was an attempted Judeocide or Holocaust in the 20th century, and adds that he thinks that the United States government is responsible for 9/11 and set it up as a provocation to allow itself to invade the Middle East. Right? Now, the reason the Pope is rehabilitating these people is because they are loyal to the first principles, not because they have betrayed them.
They're loyal to the Pope.
No, they're loyal to the first principles. The first principle is that everyone was present at Calvary. We are all guilty for the sufferings of Jesus. We were all there. Every time we sin or fall away, we increase the loneliness and the torment, and that the Jewish people, most specifically because they were witnesses to it, cannot be forgiven for the crime of deicide. That is the first principle. The Church had been moving away from this principle for, I think, largely political reasons. Now, because of its loyalty to the first principles, it is restoring into credit and union neo-fascist demagogues and crackpots. This is not a thing that a serious citizen can look at with indifference. This is happening in our communities before our very eyes. The spread and recrediting of disgusting ideas that a church should be expelling, not readmitting. Wouldn't you say so?
I want to shift gears for a moment. I want to shift gears because I think the three of you really are sort of illustrating the reason I'm asking this question. Public perception, if I may be so bold as to suggest I may have some idea of what the public perception is of each of you. For the two of you, your lives are spent, even as you struggle with your own questions of faith, in ministering to the needs and the faith needs of others. And Mr. Hitchens, you are often, rightly or wrongly, depicted as basically the angry atheist. Well, you can see that. I mean, I'm not saying that's fair. So I would like each of you, please, to address that in terms of what is it like to be who you are today? And how accurate is the perception of you that you surely, each of you already gets an idea of what people think of you most of the time. What is that like?
I am not an angry atheist. I'm a simple pious Baptist. But I happen to be a university preacher in a place that is famous both for rational discourse and alleged indifference to religion, where people are very much concerned about religion. Instead of students coming to me and saying, we'll have no more of this nonsense, they come to me and many others and they say, if you have anything to tell us, for God's sake, as it were, please do. And I do. I do it every day. I do it every Sunday. I teach, I preach, I celebrate the sacraments, I pray with people. I see them out of this life. I see them at their high moments. I see them at their low moments. And they see me as a servant of this God whom I'm prepared to serve. And I accept I understand that. Those were the terms of my ordination by which I accepted this identity as a Christian minister. And I rejoice in it. I mean, I don't do it because I think I have all the answers. I don't.
Has your confidence been relentless? Have you never had moments where...
Oh, I have doubts all the time. Moments of deep anxiety when something terrible happens, or somebody is taken before his or her time, or there is an irrationality about everything. Yes, of course I do. I'm a human being, and I'm tempted to also unchristian outbreaks of anger, violence, envy, lust, all of that. But the tradition provides a framework for me with which to deal with all of that. And that is what is so important about that tradition, as far as I'm concerned. And people see me, and I'd like to think they see me modeling and struggling as best I can within that. And when somebody says, well, how do you know? I say, well, I don't know. I believe, but I don't know. And the day will come, as Ba said of Tillich, when I will know. And I look forward to that day.
Rabbi?
It occurs to me that there is something strangely familiar about the way we're seated on the stage tonight, with Christopher Hitchens to my far left,
easily pleased,
regarding me as a deluded fanatic who thinks that God will be angry at me if I eat a ham sandwich, and the chaplain of Harvard University to my right, looking at me compassionately and with forgiveness, but still seeing me as fallen away from the true faith. I have spent most of my life being regarded from both directions that way. It changed, I think, with the publication of my book, where people began to recognize me as a spokesman for religion as a source of compassion and resilience rather than a source of God's commandments and prohibitions. And frankly, Connie, I've become a lot more comfortable with that role.
Mr. Hitchens, what's it like to be you?
Well, I'm certainly not a therapist of any kind. And don't look for consolation where it isn't to be found. And though I do this quite to a considerable extent to please myself, one of the things I used to like about the early Christian church fathers was when they could never think of a good reason, a good description, I mean to say, of why heaven would be heavenly. They were very good at hell. They could make that seem very real. They could never quite do heaven. What are you going to do after the first 100 million years of unending praise, for example? For fun, I mean. But they did come up with something which was, well, you can always go to the lip and look down on the torments of the damned. And you'll never run out of comfort and enjoyment when you see other people suffer. And I think that's it for me, actually.
Yeah.
What I like to do is increase the suffering of and taunt and jeer at the sufferings of others. When I get depressed, that's how I bring myself back up. So that's what it was until recently. It was a form of being religious. But now I've got another kind of cause imposed on me by my readers, which is this. Many people in this country think that to be a person of no faith is to be a member of a sort of despised minority. You're always left out. The politicians speak when invocations are given at inaugurations, for example, things like that. Where Billy Graham gets to give the address for the victims of 9/11 and says, I saw him say it at the National Cathedral, they're all in heaven now, and they wouldn't come back to us even if they could. Who knew there were that many saints in New York, for one thing? And it's precisely the same promise as Osama bin Laden gives to his murderers. Believe with me, and you go to paradise, and you'll be fine. nauseating garbage of this kind right across the culture. I think there maybe even be a few people in the hall this evening who are with me in saying we've sort of had enough of that. We are not spoken for by religious big mouths, and we think we have the right to live where we do actually live, which is in a secular country with a democratic secular constitution and declaration that says you don't have to believe any of this, and the government may not support it by your tax dollars. And this is a struggle of great importance, both at home and against our theocratic enemies abroad. And that one of the pleasures now of secularism, quite apart from trying to increase the misery of the other team, is that you're helping to defend the United States Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Raise your hands, those who say aye. Good. Far too few. But it will improve.
I'm wondering if, before I go to the final question before intermission, either of you would want to respond to the notion that, I mean, I think there are people of faith who also are sick of some of what you described coming from people who, you said the big mouths of faith.
Hope so.
So I'm wondering if either of you would want to respond to that as well, as men of faith.
I have never desired to speak for any religious community, and I have never desired to speak for any religious person other than myself. And I want the privilege to believe the absurd. I want the privilege to expect a great and glorious heaven. I want the privilege of being able to take the whole ball of orthodox wax to my bosom and not be thought of as ignorant or prejudicial or stupid or superstitious or any of those things. I actually, I've read my Augustine, and I've read the wonderful sort of self-indulgence where Augustine says, half the joy of the redeemed is being redeemed. The other half is watching those who aren't redeemed. Now that's quite perverse. And I don't want simply to enjoy the sight of the damned sort of straggling around the edges. But I would like the privilege of embracing the hope that is within me, the tradition that is mine. And I'd like to be able to support and encourage all those others who might in some way, either more articulate or less articulate than mine, believe the same thing. It seems to be the great thing about this republic is that it permits, and it ought to permit all of it. It ought to commit itself to preserving the right of those who do not believe not to believe. And they ought not to be forced into any kind of sort of religious straitjacket. Yet on the other hand, it also ought to be in a position to affirm conviction on the part of those who have convictions to affirm. Seems to me that's the greatness of this republic, and I too would fight to preserve that.
Rabbi?
My abstract commitment to the principle of freedom of thought and tolerance is challenged by some of the really stupid things that are done in the name of religion. I cringe when I walk into a house of mourning and I hear somebody saying to the bereaved families, it was God's will, or they're in a better place, or I remember there was a 6-year-old boy who was run over by a truck, and the clergyman officiating his funeral said, this is not a day for sadness, this is a day for rejoicing that Billy has been taken into heaven with his soul still unstained by sin. I guess that means before he was old enough to be interested in girls. And, you know, I spent a lot of my energy trying to clean up the mess that these people left behind. And yet, even as I want them to give me the right to speak in the name of God as I understand God, I feel obliged to give them the right to articulate their views. And as long as all the competing views are heard, there will be some people who, for characterological reasons, need to believe the more fundamentalist perspective, and there are others who, when given a choice, will take the more liberal view. And I don't think I could ask for anything more than that.
For the final question, I want to borrow from your book, Mr. Hitchens. There was a question that I've really been thinking about a lot. Why doesn't our religious faith make us happy? And I'd like each of you to address that as our final question before we break for intermission.
Well, gee, Connie, my religious faith makes me very happy.
It makes me happy.
I mean, sometimes it doesn't. I mean, there are times where, you know, the Red Sox are playing a playoff game on Yom Kippur and I have to miss it. But otherwise, you know, if you take a sufficiently mature view of happiness, which is not defined as doing whatever you want whenever you want to do it, I find that religion is what makes me happy, is what endows my life with transcendent meaning, is a source of guidance, and I would be lost without it.
The term happy is often used in the black church to describe the ecstasis, that sort of hallelujah moment that most people observe and comment when they enjoy almost something to excess. You'll say, oh, Sister Brown's got happy. She's dancing in the aisle. You know, it's not because she's come to some incredible intellectual understanding that finally the chips have fallen into place. No, she's overwhelmed by some sense that she counts. She's noticed, she's seen, she's heard, she's felt. And the only way she responds to that is the way the Pentecostals do. I know lots of happy Christians. Now, when I go into mainline churches, some of which I could name right here, I look out at these rather grim people. They don't look very happy. They don't look very happy. I want to say, the Presbyterians need a good colonic. That's what they need. Something needs to loosen them up and give them a little sense of...
As someone who was raised Presbyterian, I got to say amen.
Don't you know what I'm talking about? I love the old gospel hymn that says, I am happy in the service of the King. Oh, so happy I am. There used to be categories in mainline Protestant hymn books called happiness. They're all gone now, but I mean, they used to be, they were sort of embarrassed about saying, you know, I love Jesus. Jesus loves me. He loves you too. I don't know why, but he does. And, there is a sort of emotional freedom which in our desire to understand and explain everything, I think we've lost. But I think the happiness is a fundamental ingredient of faith, not anger, not violence, not anxiety. But remember, the angels come and are always offering joy, which is related to happiness. I believe in happiness.
There was a reason you asked that question.
Well, yes, but I mean, now, come on.
I didn't mean it to...
I have here, if I was to ask him if he thought Calvin was a real influence, I think I know what kind of answer I'd get.
Calvin had a real problem.
And yes, he's only a personal believer. And so, I mean, look, I think it is very ingenious. I'll have to give this to Christianity, that it manages to reconcile ecstatic shout and holler stuff with the idea of original ineffaceable sin and ineffaceable guilt. I think to be able to do that, to be able to square that circle, is to show what promising primates perhaps we are. Always able to look on the bright side. But there's nothing to be happy about if you think that you're born into a losing struggle, that you were condemned before you were born by the original sin of Adam, that sin can only be expiated if you agree to have been present at a terrible human sacrifice by torture, that you can't rest until this has been done. I mean, if I was burdened with that kind of belief, I think I would every now and then burst out in great streams of babbling joy. Kumbaya.
Well, I don't know about all of you, but I've really enjoyed the first half of this program. All right, let's get started. We've got a lot of questions. We're going to try to get through as many as we can, and we're going to try to keep it moving up here, okay? This is from Sabina. I hope I'm pronouncing this right. Does spirituality have to come with religion, or can it exist on its own By the way, what is it? What is it?
Well, I tried this before, so I'll try it again. The idea of the numinous, the feeling that there's a little more to life than the material. You can't measure love, but you feel you know it not when you see it, when you experience it, and so on. The feeling of transcendence actually might be a better word than numinous. I think it's very important to preserve that while not allowing the supernatural to own it or trespass on it. An example I would give, though I know very little about music, Verdi, who no one would deny was able to write beautiful music of a devotional kind as well, actually was quite a decided atheist. It didn't mean that he couldn't produce music of that kind. And as I say, I think it's a great cultural project to try and harmonize and preserve and intensify the numinous and the transcendent without giving anything to the supernatural or the superstitious. Or the spiritual.
I have a friend who defines spirituality as what you feel and religion as what you do as the consequence of what you feel. And he says that spirituality is important but not enough. It has to get translated into action.
I had a friend who gave a wonderful little chat in chapel, and she said, I'm not good enough to be spiritual. By that she meant spirituality is this intersection with the divine or the transcendent or the noble. She said, I'm not good enough for that. But I am good enough to be religious, which is going by the rules and trying to figure out how to be better than you ordinarily would be. Now, I hear from people all the time, I'm not into religion, but I am spiritual. And there is a kind of moral superiority that is ascribed to this notion of spirituality. You go into any bookstore today, and the spirituality section is very large, defined by cushions on the floor and floating candles. And it's very odoriferous. That's spirituality. Well, I go with my friend. I'm not good enough to be spiritual. I told somebody I'm a material man trapped in a spiritual body, and I have to live in the real world, and therefore religion is important because it gives me some hints as to how to proceed through that. Pure spirituality strikes me as a very dangerous distillate.
This is from Iggy. All three panelists are men. Why? And how do women fit into today's religion? And this is for all of you.
Well, it's hard for me to justify being a man. I was born this way.
Your committee asked us. There must be hundreds of women, thousands of spiritual women, religious women who could have filled these seats as well as we have, but your people didn't ask them. They asked us. So, Iggy, write to the forum people. Don't ask us.
I think I'm sensing a little defensiveness here, but we're going to...
No, I'm not going to be defensive. I mean, I am more in touch with my feminine side than may seem self-evident, but there is a very interesting question. I very often ask myself, it's not as true about Judaism as the other monotheisms, but especially Roman Catholicism and Islam. If you go to the great sites of pilgrimage and you go to the great occasions of great holidays, and women are the ones who keep it going. And they're the ones who are in church on off hours as well, doing their little private things off to the side, little ceremonies. I'm pretty sure I know why this is, by the way. Because women do the childbearing. And because in many of the societies, very poor originally, where these religions are regnant, it's quite common to lose a child. And certainly the fear of losing one is very great. I say this as sensitively as I dare in the presence of someone who's actually had that terrible experience, but it's usually on women that falls most particularly. I think women decide that they won't take any chances. If there's the remotest chance that a ritual or an observance or a little bit of sacrifice or donation would help with the children, they'll take that chance.
Well, let's pursue this a little bit, the second half of this. How do women fit into today's religion?
By the way, just to add to the Professor Reverend's point earlier, when you come to New Age stuff and Gaia and the rest of it, you find that there's a very strong feminine principle in all that too, often amounting to actual Wiccan or witchcraftian cults. It's very feminized, the New Age, and I think that may well be for the same reason. It's a widely held belief, including, I think, one that's shared by a lot of very baffled men, that somehow there is something more spiritual about being female.
You know, I guess I thought in most churches, women do so much because women always do so much. But if we could pursue it, if you have anything to add, what is the role for women to play in today's religious life?
Connie, I think one of the great stories of religion the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st is, at least in Judaism, reaching out to embrace women and give them the opportunity to serve. Traditionally, there was this, something that may have been justifiable a couple of thousand years ago, that women have these responsibilities at home, and so they have to be exempt from the public practice of Judaism. Well, you know, it's very hard to justify the fact if you have women representatives and senators and ambassadors and governors and women pilots and women surgeons. It's a little hard for them to say, well, they're so busy with their domestic responsibilities, they can't do anything in the public sphere. So in my lifetime, I have seen the accession of women rabbis and cantors and judges and scholars and professors till now, except for, I don't want to dismiss them as a fringe, but except for the Orthodox corner of Jewish faith, and even they're being challenged. Women are totally involved in whatever is going on.
That's true enough. I mean, the most pain-in-the-ass rabbi I've ever debated was called Julian Neuberger.
I'm sure you mean
the thing, when I say in my book and elsewhere that religion is man-made, I also mean to say that it's male-made. It's very much set up as a system of male domination originally, and it surely very much shows. No religion that I know about is there not, for example, some terrifying fear of menstrual blood. You can't come to communion if you're on the rag. It's true. Of all Christians, look it up. That's one reason they don't want women doing the service of Mass either, is that it could be the wrong Friday or Sunday or whatever it might be. It's through all the texts. They feel women are unclean vessels. They think that they should be naturally subordinate to men. The Jewish prayer has to begin by thanking God for not making you female.
Hey,
and the females have to say, thank you for making me what I am.
Rabbi, what did you say?
Yeah, we threw that out 75 years ago.
Some Jews did. Some Jews, the Reform Jews and some conservatives did, but there's a reason why it lasted as long. Religion is in very many ways a male racket.
Women have, in my lifetime, transformed much of Protestantism. When I was a divinity student over 40 years ago, probably less than 2% of the seminarians were women. Now they're nearing 60%. And every denomination, every Protestant denomination has had to deal with the ordination of women. Most have dealt with it successfully. And women are ordained and form a large and significant portion of the clergy in these places, as they always have formed a large and significant proportion of the congregations. Usually, when I travel around the church, usually Sunday morning, it would probably be 70% female in the congregation, and that would be not thought to be unusual. They used to say, if you want something said, get a man. If you want something done, get a woman. And that was the way it was in the church. Now, if I were organizing this panel at Harvard, I wouldn't dare not have a woman in it. I would be given a lot of grief. And,
by the way,
and Iggy, whoever you are, would not have the chance to ask that question.
No.
But
or not with such an androgynous name.
That's right. That's right. Come on, Iggy.
Come on, Iggy. Let's be having it.
Let's not pick on Iggy.
But there's progress on all fronts, I should add. I mean, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban don't allow women to join. You can't, but there are more and more in Iraq and in Lebanon. Female suicide bombers, all the same, are being admitted to the ranks. So the more that women are encouraged to be religious, the more religious they will become.
You're pretty pleased with
Yeah,
yourself.
absolutely.
For that one,
Yeah.
All right.
I wish them joy of it, too.
Christopher Hitchens, this question is for you from Janine. In working for the dying for over 40 years, I have found no person who is not afraid to die. I've often found, I'm not sure I'm reading this correctly, but many people who are afraid to die. What would you say or do for a dying friend to help them?
Well, it's not a hypothetical question. I mean, none of us hasn't had the experience of a dying friend or relative. I'm actually not the one who is particularly asked to be there for the obsequies.
I got you.
They tend to say, you remember that nice dinner we had about 5 years ago where we were all on corking form? Yeah. But I'm sure that the fact that I'm not asked to be at the bedside is nothing to do with the fact that I have no false consolation to offer. And that I don't think there's anything to be afraid about. You're not going to know you're dead. There's nothing to be afraid about. The only thing that you could think of that would be really terrifying is if you were told you're going to go on living forever. Now, there's a really unbearable thought. A really disgusting one, and I can't offer that either.
Rabbi, I suppose you've heard this question before. I think it's for the panel. Why do good things happen to bad people?
Why do bad people get away with murder? I have lost track of how many people have urged me to write a book by that title. And my response is, who would buy it? Who would you give it as a present to?
Well, it's too late for Mr. Madoff now, but he would have liked it a year ago.
I would say bottom line is, yeah, it's a very disturbing phenomenon. Most of the time, I think, you don't really get away with anything in this world. You pay for everything you take in this world in one currency or another. The Bernard Madoffs, even if he had not been caught, would have missed out on much of what it means to be a human being. The guy who cheats on his wife and doesn't get caught and thinks he's really clever and he's pulled it off will never know what it really feels like to invest all of your love in a single relationship. You pay for everything you take in life in one currency or another, and sometimes when the bill comes due, you go back and wish you'd played it differently.
Professor, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I once said that Rabbi had given me a wonderful definition of the word envy. I envied his royalties. And there was a sense in which he spoke, and does speak, to the fundamental question that we all ask. But I would write a slightly different book. My book would be, why do good people do wicked things? And the church is full of good people who are tempted and actually sometimes succeed in doing wicked things. Now, our tradition teaches that there's the doctrine of original sin. It sort of explains everything. You're all naturally wicked, and you'll do wicked things unless you're inhibited against them, which provides a very rational theology, but wouldn't preach very well these days, especially, I'm sure, in Hartford, Connecticut. But the fact of the matter is, the greater question for me is people who want to do the right thing, want to be thought of as good and virtuous, often end up doing terrible things. And I think of St. Paul's famous line, the good that I would do, that I do not. And that which I would not do, that I do. That's the human and the moral dilemma. And it seems to me that's the task to which, confession, forgiveness, amendment of life, all of that is directed towards. So that would be my take, but I don't think my book would do as well as Rabbi's book.
Do you want to add anything?
Yeah. There are things that a morally normal, even a very morally average or mediocre person would not unprompted do. For example, hold down their daughter at the age of 6, tear off her underwear, and cut her genitalia with a sharp stone. They wouldn't do that if they didn't think God was telling them to do it, or the mullahs, or if it's a boy, the rabbis weren't telling them to do it. One of the reasons why I have the lurid subtitle I do of my book, Religion is a Poison, is that it makes ordinary moral people, compels them, forces them, in some cases orders them to do disgusting, wicked, unforgivable things. There's no expiation for the generations of misery and suffering that religion has inflicted in this way and continues to inflict, and I still haven't heard enough apology for it.
Rabbi, you want to do something?
Christopher, I've got to call you down on referring to circumcision as genital mutilation. My son cried more at his first haircut than he did at his bris. And statistically...
You weren't doing it right then.
Statistically, the only long-term effect that it seems to have on people is it increases their chances of winning a Nobel Prize.
I can't find the compulsory mutilation of the genitals of children a subject for humor in that way, or flippancy in that way. Maimonides says very plainly that it's designed to repress sexual pleasure, to deprive us, a male child as far as possible of the opportunity of that. The full excision, not just the snip or the full mandatory covenant is fantastically painful, leads to trauma, leads to the dulling of the sexual relationship, and can be in itself life-threatening at that moment. We have the records, I can show them to you, of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds in the United States, boy babies who've died or had life-threatening infections as a result of this disgusting practice. That a person as humane as yourself can sit here and think of that as a fit subject for humor shows what I mean. Religion makes morally normal people say and do disgusting and wicked things, and you've just proved my point for me. Shame on you for saying what you just said. Shame on you for saying it about your own son, my God.
Let's move on.
Yes, let's.
What next? Cutting the labia of little girls. At least Judaism doesn't do that.
This is a question.
What if a Muslim was to say to you just now, my little girl cried more at her first haircut than when I cut off her clitoris? What would you think of me if I was to say such a disgusting thing?
Well,
remember, we are not talking about detail here. We're talking about whether religion makes people behave better or not.
Let's give the rabbi a chance. I wanted to move on, but let's give the rabbi a chance to respond to what you said, because it got pretty personal here. So,
again, my experience in my own son, my own grandson, hundreds of congregants, has been that it's not nothing like what you're talking about, and that for whatever reason that this has become an issue for you, I just think is excessive.
What do you mean by that?
Oh.
What do you mean by that?
That I'm more personally...
There's an undertone of innuendo to this. Let's bring it on.
No, there's no innuendo there. What I'm saying is,
sure.
I've lived through this personally, and...
You've inflicted it, is what you're saying.
I've been what?
You've inflicted it, or officiated at it, is what you're saying, isn't it?
Well, officiated, yes. Inflicted, no. Forget Maimonides. Maimonides has his hang-ups about that.
I should forget Maimonides. Since when do you say that?
Because on issues of sexuality, Maimonides has some very medieval ideas. I ran across the line in your book that Orthodox Jews have sex through a hole in a bedsheet. Do you know Orthodox Jews who told you they have sex that way?
No. I say it is said of Orthodox Jews that they may do that.
All right, gentlemen, I'm sorry to break this up.
That's a Reformed Jewish rumor about Orthodox.
We have a lot of questions from the audience, and I want to give others a chance.
Genital mutilation is no joke.
This is a question for the rabbi and the professor. Is there room in heaven for Mr. Hitchens, and why?
God is gracious.
I have no idea what happens in heaven or what the criteria are for getting there. But if anybody can get in, I have no doubt that Mr. Hitchens can. He's very sincere. He's very heartfelt. I think that if I were God, I would set the bar so low that one really has to be a pretty deliberately wicked person to be barred. I have a Christian friend who said something I like very much. He said, I believe there is a hell, but nobody lives there, because God is too compassionate to consign anyone to it. No, I think I don't think of dying and going to heaven as being the equivalent of moving out of New England and retiring to Florida. If there is any kind of existence after life, it must be a disembodied kind of existence, and I am utterly incompetent to imagine what it must be like. But I don't see any reason why Mr. Hitchens and Dr. Gomes and I can't all share it together the way we've shared this evening.
Mr. Hitchens, this question's for you. I suspect they're referring to an interview you gave to public radio here, but I'm not sure. On the radio you said you don't think Obama is a believer, even though he says he is. Why do you think that?
Well, it's my reading of his very beautifully written memoir, where he talks about the way that his mother explained to him how improbable it would be that there was any such thing as a divine intervention, and how he fully understands what she's saying and seems to find it persuasive and convincing, as indeed who would not. And then a few heartbeats later, he's saying, well, I'm in Chicago. I'm interested in a political career. I need to shop around and find some church in the community, because you can't do politics without shopping around for a church. And as all the world now knows, he picked the wrong one. And that's partly because he didn't particularly give a damn which one it was. That really is my reading of it. And he dumped it when it no longer suited him, furthermore, which you don't if you're a person of faith, that thing we're all supposed to respect and shouldn't. Since I said that on public radio and I attended the inauguration, I noticed two things in his speech which might be worth pointing out. One is been noticed quite a lot, that he included the words non-believer, word or term non-believer, in his list of Americans. Well, that's nice. And overdue. And then, but this is interesting, this is like a sort of Straussian reading of the inaugural speech, but I commend it to you. At the end, when he says, at the great crisis of our revolution, George Washington, at the lowest moment of all, ordered the following words to be read to the people. And he then says these words about how, at the most frigid and wintry passage of the crisis, let it be recorded that the city and the people came out to meet it. I have the words almost exactly right. Anyway, that's Thomas Paine, not George Washington. And it's from the crisis, as some people will already have noticed. And what is interesting to me is that the president's peroration should be from the man who wrote The Age of Reason, who said that Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are all rubbish and nonsense, though he was, in fact, a deist. And why he would close with that man's words and try and attribute them to George Washington instead of Thomas Paine. Or wouldn't quite work the words Paine into the speech. Still, at least Paine's words have been now uttered by the president at his inaugural, and I would say that was an improvement on the preceding religious babble one had to put up with.
Have you had a chance to have this conversation with President Obama?
I have not had the opportunity to ask the president about it, but there's someone I'm pursuing this with who might come back to me. Yeah. Anyway, for now, I think it's intriguing.
This question's from Jen. What will the world of faith be like 100 years from now?
Oh, who knows the answer to that? I mean, that's, I don't know. I simply don't know, and I wouldn't trust anybody who said they did.
As they say in Quaker meetings, this friend speaks for me.
Rabbi?
I would just hope that there's still people around 100 years from now so that the issue becomes relevant.
Okay. Because religions, this is from David, because religions disagree on specifics, is the ideal debate between believers and non-believers, or rather should it be among the different religions? Who'd like to take that on first?
I think both have to happen. I think that religious discourse is only advanced, quite frankly, within and among the religious, among believers. They have similar values, similar things at stake. They care. And so there is going to be there ought to be some honest conversation there. A sidebar to that is the conversation between those who believe and those who don't believe at all. But I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's both.
I don't like the idea of setting it up as a debate, the idea being that one of us will disprove the other. I think the most exciting thing that's happened in my lifetime is that religious leaders have learned to listen to each other. When I was growing up, we only spoke to people of our own faith and disparaged others. I know devout Christians who keep a Jewish Sabbath as a day of disengagement from the world, as well as Sunday as the Lord's Day for church. I know Jews who have incorporated Buddhist meditation into their daily worship. I know Buddhists who are enchanted by the Christian notion of a God who enters into our suffering to make it less painful. This reciprocal contribution, I think, is a tremendous step forward. And I would like to think that between theists and non-theists, there is some kind of possibility for a similar fruitful exchange.
It's a bit mushy, isn't it, this I'm okay, you're okay ecumenicism, as well as, if I may say so, a bit ahistorical. Hundreds and thousands and millions of people died on these points of distinction and thought that their lives were well thrown away for it. And I think one ought to respect that and not talk as if this is just a general discussion about how we can all get along. I said earlier that if you're a deist and you can say you think there is a God, you have all your work still ahead of you before you can be a theist and show there's a God who intervenes in human affairs. But once you've done that, there's a huge amount of trouble ahead. It's not my problem, but the Roman Catholics believe that ex ecclesia nulla salus, outside their church there's no salvation. You're not really a Christian unless you're their kind of Christian. I know many, many Protestants who say the same about Catholics, that Catholicism is a terrible heresy. A large part of my country of birth was convulsed in murder and destruction on this point, which kind of Christian you had to be in order to be a real one. These are not small distinctions, and people invoke them as strongly as they will invoke the idea that there's a God or a Christ or a Messiah in the first place. I don't believe the rabbi really thinks it doesn't matter if someone is Buddhist or Jewish. I don't believe he's got to that ecumenical stage. I don't believe he does. If he does, he's in a very small minority in his community. I think these things must be taken seriously. Now, you asked me, and it's a joke question, do I think I'm going to paradise? Of course not. I wouldn't go if I was asked. I don't want to live in some fucking celestial North Korea, for one thing, where all I get to do is praise the dear leader from dawn till dusk. I don't want this. It would be hell for me. So let's get that clear. But when Rick Warren, who's invited to give the inauguration of an elected constitutional president of these United States, was asked in Colorado the other day by a Jewish woman, "Can I come to your paradise?" He says, "No." Well, screw him. And don't let's say that there's a nothing distinction. The trouble with religion only starts when people have affirmed that it's true. It only begins then. Then comes the really nice bit, interreligious warfare. That's the really agreeable part.
Question from Howard. A priest, a rabbi, and an atheist walk into a bar. Finish the joke.
And the barman says, "What is this, some kind of joke?"
Any contributions, gentlemen?
Move on.
Move on.
Move on.
Why is religion so often associated with killing, wars, etc.? This is from Bill.
Well, Bill, religious people who engage in killing, war, and violence believe they are carrying out the dictates of their God. And so they are justified in doing whatever it is that they do. And there's a certain rational understanding of that, but it's also contrary in many ways to the heart of most of the religious traditions, that we are not God. We do not do what God does. And if God does that, then that's God's business, not ours. That's where the modesty bit comes in. And that's what makes of Christianity such a powerful and compelling witness against which so much of our tradition has gone. Christianity doesn't tell you to go out and kill people and do all these terrible things in the name of Jesus. In fact, it says quite the opposite. But that's what we do. And that's why we have to be taught. And that's why we have to confess. And that's why we have to be transformed.
Rabbi, you were motioning.
Yeah, Peter, I think maybe it works the other way around. It's not that religious people go out and kill and carry on wars. It's that people kill and carry on wars. And at some basic human level, they intuit that what they're doing is wrong. And so they look for the veneer of religion to cover it and justify what they are doing. They are kidnapping and misusing religion to excuse what they recognize as misbehavior.
Wouldn't that be exactly the other way around if we take the best-known territorial and ethnic and theological quarrel presently in the world, the Israel-Palestine dispute? There we have a small territory about the size of Wales, the other end of the Mediterranean. There are roughly as many Palestinian Arabs, Christian and Muslim, mainly more Muslim now than there were, as there are Israeli Jews. It's a very long-standing territorial dispute that's inherited by us from the League of Nations mandate. It's the oldest territorial quarrel on the international agenda. Everybody knows what the solution is. Two peoples, roughly equivalent claims to a parcel of land, and they're roughly the same population proportion. Something like a partition, something like a two-state solution, some version of this, is what is voted for by the international community, the European Union, the UN, the US, almost all American Jews, I think I can say, certainly the majority of Israeli Jews, more grudgingly by the majority of Palestinians, by several neighboring Arab states and so forth. It's obvious. The alternatives are too horrible to contemplate. Why can't we get it? Why can we not get it? Because the parties of God have a veto on the process. Small, true, but they are not baptizing retrospectively their crimes in the name of God. They're committing the original crimes as a divine mandate. They're saying, no, no, no. No one has the right to live here but us. God gave us this territory. It is holy land. Our God gives it all to us. It's exactly the opposite of what the rabbi just said. And we're all going to go to hell on a sled with this war, which is now I think, being made insoluble and incurable as a dispute.
Christopher, I would remind you...
If you think it's bad now, you wait and see how bad it is, because the parties of God are in charge. And that means civilization is going to be challenged.
I would remind you that at Taba in 2001, the Israeli government was prepared to sign on to a two-state solution, and Arafat refused to go along with it.
What if it meant kicking the Messianists out of the West Bank?
I have a final question for you. I'd like to start with you, Christopher Hitchens. I'm wondering...
Surely I've said enough. Who doesn't think that?
What keeps you up at night, and what gives you hope?
I'm certainly not going to tell you the first. And as for hope, I'm a great believer in the uses of pessimism. Once you've worked out that you are born into a losing struggle, and you don't take false consolation, and you're not happy, clappy, the sky can suddenly clear. For a bit.
Rabbi, what keeps you up at night, and what gives you hope?
Never quite sure what keeps me up at night. I'll tell you what gives me hope. Very often the question is phrased to me in terms of, do you think human beings are getting better or getting worse? And my answer is yes. I think in some ways we're getting better, in some ways we're getting worse. And I perceive a glacial but perceptible increase in human goodness. Behavior which was acceptable in wars generations ago is now at least controversial, if not forbidden. 19th century novels, is there a Dickens novel which doesn't have the death of children in every other chapter? That was taken as part of life. 21st century, the death of a child is a shattering tragedy. Behavior which we tolerated not that long ago is at least embarrassing and very often just proscribed. So I think we are slowly coming closer to the image of what the fully realized human being is going to be. And that gives me hope.
Professor?
What keeps me up at night from time to time, not every night, but from time to time, is the terrible fear that we will think we're so clever that we'll blow ourselves up. And I think that the nuclear button is a real terrifying existential dilemma. And the more of those nuclear buttons out there, the more I worry that some idiot in some position of authority will do it. And life as we know it will end. I do worry about that because I have very little confidence in the people who have the ultimate responsibility, no matter what country they're in, to prevent that from happening. What gives me hope is the ultimate conviction, the long-term conviction that human beings will come to their senses, and that is to say that there will be a desire to live out the highest aspirations of one's religious faith, and not simply the cultural or the minimal ones. I follow the philosopher, the mid-20th century, early 20th century, who was fond of saying that he was a short-term pessimist, but a long-term optimist. In the long run, he believed it would turn out all right. In the short run, people will do nasty and wicked things. And we just have to sort of get through that in order to get to that brighter thing. If I didn't have that hope, I don't think I would be a minister.
Gentlemen, thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your wisdom.